Hey everybody. So last class we talked about interviewing as a reporter, how you handle yourself during an interview, how you get yourself prepared for an interview, etc. So now let's talk a little bit about what you're going to do with all of those quotes that you get from your interview. Quotes are really important in journalism because they connect the reader directly to the source. They are intended to be exactly, word for word, exactly what the source said. So you're going to make sure that you are getting everything exactly right when you type those up. Now we'll talk in a future class about what to do with stuff like verbal fillers, which is ums, what to do with words like the word like, which gets used as a verbal filler sometimes, what to use with curse words and expletives. All of that stuff we'll talk about at a later date. But for now, we're just going to go forward with the idea that direct quotes are word for word exactly what a source says to you, and how you frame that in the story is by putting quotation marks around it, so that the audience has the assumption that anything that is in a quotation marks is exactly how the source said it. It gives a sense of honesty and a sense of credibility to the story, and it gives a sense of transparency of direction of information from the source directly to the audience. So now, what if the source says something that's really interesting, but the way they say it isn't great? Maybe they stumble over their words, maybe they say something that isn't very correct in grammar, or what if they say a couple of things that are awesome, but they're all said in different parts of the sentence or parts of the conversation? What we can do then is something called paraphrase. Now, the reason why I'm bringing up paraphrasing is because it's really, really important and powerful in journalism. The idea of the paraphrase is when we put the information that a source said into our own words, but we still attribute it. We still very clearly say to the reader, hey, this person said this thing, but we don't use direct quotes because it's not word for word. So if we say something like, Smith said the event will be postponed because of the thunderstorms on the forecast, and the tickets will be refunded if people can't make it. Both of these may be ideas that were said at different times during the interview, but because they match each other, we'll put them together and we'll attach attribution to it so that the audience still gets that information. Now keep in mind that during a regular interview, especially if the interview goes upwards of 15 or 20 minutes, you're going to get a lot of potentially good or potential direct quotes. A lot of stuff that will come from that interview that you could, in theory, slap quotation marks around and put in your story. The problem, though, is that if you overload a story with direct quotes, you lose a lot of the narrative aspect of the story. Also, the audience weirdly will turn away from the story and not want to read it if they see too many quotes. So what you have to do is act like a colander. You have to strain out the best possible quotes from your story. You have to keep a close eye on the transcript that you've made after your interview's done, and the sort of keeping an eye on it during the interview itself, to keep an eye on, hey, what are the best possible things that the source is saying that I could pull out and use as a quote in the story? And the best quotes are things that are colorful or compelling, that are action-filled or opinionated. They have the source's perspective in them. Stuff that you couldn't otherwise get, or that you would lose a little bit of the impact on if you tried to make it a paraphrase. Now, all of this juxtaposed with, hey, you know what doesn't make for very good quotes? Stuff like statistics, numbers, basic facts. Those aren't very interesting for direct quotes. Usually stuff that's very opinionated or colorful, those are the things that make for the best direct quotes. And so here's some basic rules for actually putting those quotes into your story, for getting them formatted correctly when we are writing through the process of the inverted pyramid. Rule number 1 is a really important one, and it is that quotes need to be their own paragraph. So when you're typing your story up, you've got your lead, you're sort of moved a couple paragraphs off the lead, and you're ready to quote somebody for the first time directly in the story. You need to hit enter from the paragraph you're on, and then you need to type out your direct quote, and when you're done, you need to hit enter again and keep on working. Now, usually we want to use the paragraph before the quote itself to transition into the quote. We want to set up any needed context or clarification in order to make the quote make sense, and we do that in the paragraph before the quote. So I pulled this from an example. This was a story from this morning, actually, from Friday morning, of a story from the USA Today about how Some members of a cartel in Mexico are smuggling methamphetamine into soda bottles to try to smuggle them across the border. So there's some worry about, hey, what happens if you drink meth soda? So here's the sort of block of information. Dr. Daniel Brooks at Banner Health cautioned anyone traveling to Mexico, period. Notice we're transitioning into the direct quote, so we hit enter, we have tabbed over into a new paragraph. It is important to check that the seal for any food and drink consumed is still intact and shows no signs of tampering, comma, Brooks said. Notice that the comma is inside of the quotation marks, and now that our direct quote is done, we hit enter, and we start with our next paragraph. Some side effects of drinking contaminated sodas are burning of the esophagus and stomach, vomiting, and a fast or irregular heartbeat, according to the Banner Health website. I don't know about you, but meth soda does not sound very fun. Second rule, quotes have got to be attributed. You always have to very clearly tell the audience who is saying what. You have to very clearly tell them who is being quoted. And we're always going to do that by putting the attribution at the end of the first sentence of the block of quotes. No matter how many sentences you end up using, it always has to go at the very end of the first sentence. So let's say you use a one-sentence quote, something like this: none of the 7-Up products sold in the United States are affected by the issue being reported in Mexico, Barnes said. Notice that the end of the quote is a comma inside of the quotation marks, followed by the attribution, Barnes said, period. So if we add a second sentence to this, it would be, none of these 7-Up products sold in the United States are affected by the issues being reported in Mexico, Barnes said, period. And then notice we pick up with a second quotation mark, Dr. Pepper Snapple owns and licenses the 7-Up brand only in the United States and its territories, period, quotation marks to end everything out. Now, a couple of things formatting-wise to keep note of here. One, in AP style, Dr. Pepper doesn't have a period, which I've always thought is really weird. Also, notice that the whole thing at the very end ends in a period as opposed to a comma, because the second sentence doesn't contain its own attribution. Now, finally, we add a third sentence. None of the 7-Up products sold in the United States are affected by the issues being reported in Mexico, Barnes said, period. Dr. Pepper Snapple owns and licenses the 7-Up brand only in the United States and its territories, period. We do not market or sell or distribute the brand internationally, period. Notice that the second sort of part of the block of quote doesn't have their own individual quotation marks where those sentences split. So between and its territories and we do not, there's not a quotation mark there setting off the second sentence because it's all a part of that grouping of quotation. Also, everything ends in a period, and once again, the period is inside of the quotation mark. Now, all of this leads us to our next point, which is number 3, that no more than 3 sentences can end up in each quote paragraph or each quote block. So essentially, when we're talking about a quote block, we're talking about a single paragraph of quotes. The issue is that if we cram too much of a single quote paragraph, too much in a single quote paragraph, it's going to make the reader not want to read the story. Because think about the size of a newspaper column and the shape of it, or the size and shape of your smartphone, for example, now that so many people read news off of mobile apps. If you take a very large quotation paragraph and you squish it together, it's going to make it seem enormous. The same reason why we have limitations on our paragraph size in this class, that any no paragraph should go longer than 3 sentences. The same applies for blocks of quotation. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't use more than 3 sentences from a single source in a direct quote. It just means that you need to make more quote paragraphs. So you use maybe 1 or 2 sentences from one person once, and then have another transition paragraph, or later in the story, use more from them. It's always talking about at a time. Also, people rarely ever say that very rarely will say that many interesting things in a row. That's just really not the way it works. And we have to keep things in context, which leads us to our sort of our 4th point here, which is another reason why we generally don't use more than 3 sentences at a time in a block of quotes. We need to keep the context of the quotes honest. We need to make sure that what the reader ends up seeing is what was said and how it was said, with the framework and how it was said clearly presented. So what we're talking about here is following the ABC rule. So if we have a block of quotes set up like this is the example we used earlier, we would label the first block block A, the second block block B, and the third block block C. So we have A, B, and C. A represented by yellow, B represented by red, C represented by blue. Now let's say we want to trim some of this off. What we could do is this. We could either get rid of C and keep A and B together, or we could get rid of A and keep B and C together. Because they're touching each other, they're fine. These things were actually said in this order. Now what we can't do is take A and take C and put them together by getting rid of B. The problem here is that this implies that these two sentences were said back to back, and they weren't. It's not actually what was said. It can seem a little bit silly, or it can seem innocuous, because the context for this one is still pretty much there. But it's all about being clear and honest with the reader, and if we're being clear and honest with the reader, that's not the direct order those sentences were said. So let's say we want to use A and we want to use C. What should we do? Well, we should just put them in different quote paragraphs. Use one sentence, then transition with a paraphrase, and then lead into quote C. So hopefully this clarifies a little bit about how to use direct quotes, and I look forward to seeing you all next week. Have a great weekend.